The restaurant was buzzing with the usual dinner crowd, the air filled with the clinking of silverware and low conversation. Among the waitstaff was Lisa, a sharp-tongued, quick-footed waitress who had been working there for a few months. She was good at her job but had a habit of making snarky remarks, especially when she thought a customer didn't deserve special treatment. That night, an older man walked in alone. Dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans, he carried himself with an ease that came with age and confidence. His face was lined with years of experience, his eyes sharp yet kind. He took a seat in the corner, away from the busier tables. Lisa walked over, not recognizing him, and sighed. "What can I get you?" she asked, barely masking her impatience. The man glanced at the menu. "I'll have the steak, medium rare," he said in a calm, gravelly voice. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Sure thing, cowboy," she muttered, under her breath, writing down the order. As she turned to leave, she heard the man chuckle softly. "Something funny?" she snapped, looking back at him. "Not at all," he said, meeting her gaze with an amused expression. "Just reminds me of the way folks used to talk to me." Lisa scoffed. "Yeah? You some kind of old-time movie star or something?" she said sarcastically. "Don't get too comfortable. This ain't Hollywood." A few customers at nearby tables exchanged glances, recognizing the man immediately. The manager, Mark, happened to be walking by and overheard the exchange. His face went pale. "Lisa," he hissed, pulling her aside. "Do you have any idea who that is?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "Some old guy who thinks he's important?" Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's Clint Eastwood, and he owns this restaurant." Lisa froze, feeling her stomach drop. "You're kidding." "No, I'm not. And if you want to keep your job, you better fix this. Now." Her face flushed red as she turned back toward the table, suddenly aware of how rude she had been. She swallowed hard and approached Clint Eastwood with a forced smile. Sir, I didn't realize who you were. I'm really sorry if I was disrespectful." Eastwood looked at her for a long moment, then simply nodded. "Apology accepted," he said. Relieved but still nervous, Lisa made sure his order was perfect, bringing his steak out herself and checking in on him twice as often as any other customer. But as the meal went on, she couldn't help but notice that Eastwood never seemed angry. He didn't scold her, didn't humiliate her. He simply carried on as if nothing had happened. When he finished, he left a generous tip and stood up. As he made his way to the door, he turned back and met Lisa's gaze. "Remember," he said, his voice steady, "you never know who you're talking to. Kindness costs nothing." With that, he walked out, leaving Lisa standing there, feeling the weight of the lesson she had just learned. Lisa stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Clint Eastwood's words settling in. The restaurant seemed quieter now, as if everyone had been holding their breath. A few customers glanced her way, some amused, others shaking their heads knowingly. Mark, the manager, let out a deep sigh, rubbing his temples before giving Lisa a look that was part relief, part disappointment. "You got lucky," he muttered. "He's a good man. If that had been anyone else, you might have been out of a job." Lisa nodded, still processing what had just happened. She had always prided herself on being sharp, on not taking nonsense from anyone, but tonight had shown her something different, something she hadn't even realized about herself. For the rest of her shift, she moved a little slower, more thoughtful with her words, paying closer attention to how she spoke to people. She caught herself before making a sarcastic remark to an elderly couple, and instead gave them a warm smile. She asked a single mother dining with her 2 kids if they needed anything extra, and when a busboy accidentally dropped a tray of dishes, instead of rolling her eyes, she bent down to help him pick up the pieces. By the end of the night, Lisa felt exhausted, not from work, but from the quiet realization that she had been going about things the wrong way. She wasn't a bad person, but she had let her attitude become a shield, assuming the worst in people before they even had a chance to prove her wrong. As she was clocking out, Mark walked by and stopped. "You okay?" he asked. Lisa let out a breath and nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." He studied her for a second before nodding. "Good." The next day, Lisa came into work with a new mindset. She still had her wit. Old habits didn't change overnight, but she used it differently. She joked with customers in a way that made them smile, not feel dismissed. She listened more, judged less. A week later, the restaurant received a handwritten note. It was addressed to the staff, but Lisa knew exactly who it was meant for. "To the hard-working team at my restaurant, thank you for always providing great service. I appreciate the effort you put into making this place what it is. And to one waitress in particular, keep learning, keep growing. Life's full of surprises. Kindness is one of the best ones." There was no signature, but none was needed. Lisa folded the note carefully, a small smile forming on her lips. It wasn't just a lesson. It was a moment that had changed her. She tucked the note into her apron pocket, ready to start her shift. Not just as a waitress, but as someone who finally understood the power of a little respect. As weeks passed, Lisa found herself thinking often about that night, about the moment she realized she had misjudged Clint Eastwood, about the quiet wisdom in his words, and about the note that had arrived later. She didn't just keep it in her apron pocket, she kept it in her heart. She didn't become a perfect person overnight, but she did become a better one. She started listening more, really seeing the people who came into the restaurant instead of just rushing through her shift. The regulars noticed. The other staff noticed. Even Mark, who had always been tough on her, started giving her approving nods when he saw her go the extra mile. One evening, just as the dinner rush was starting, Lisa glanced toward the entrance and felt her stomach drop. Clint Eastwood had returned. He stepped inside, the same effortless confidence about him, but this time Lisa didn't feel the urge to roll her eyes. Instead, she felt something else, gratitude. She smoothed her apron and took a deep breath before walking over to his table. "Good evening, Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice steady but sincere. "It's nice to see you again." Clint raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "Is it now?" he asked, his tone teasing. Lisa chuckled, shaking her head. "Yeah, it is." She handed him a menu, even though she was sure he already knew what he wanted. But before she could walk away, she hesitated. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I just wanted to say I was wrong about you and I appreciate what you did. I needed that lesson." For a moment, Clint just studied her. The same piercing gaze that had once made her nervous now filled with something softer. Then he nodded. "Good," he said simply. "Then it was worth it." Lisa smiled and nodded back before taking his order. And as she walked away, she felt lighter, like she had stepped into a new version of herself. One who knew that sometimes the best lessons come from the most unexpected places. As the night went on, Lisa found herself sneaking glances at Clint Eastwood's table. He wasn't just another celebrity passing through. He was the reason she had changed, even if in the smallest ways. When she brought him his meal, Clint looked up at her. "You like working here?" he asked, cutting into his steak. Lisa hesitated. A month ago, she might have scoffed and given some sarcastic remark about how much she loved being on her feet for hours. But now she thought about it. "It's not so bad," she admitted. "I used to think it was just a job I had to get through, but lately, I've been looking at things differently." Clint nodded approvingly. "That's good. Most people don't realize that how you do one thing is how you do everything." Lisa thought about that as she moved through the restaurant, attending to other customers, refilling drinks, and clearing plates. It wasn't about the job itself. It was about the attitude she brought to it. Toward the end of the night, as the restaurant emptied out, Clint signaled for the check. Lisa brought it over, but as he reached for his wallet, he paused and looked at her. "How's Mark treating you?" he asked casually. Lisa smirked. "He still barks orders, but I think he's noticed the change. I guess I have you to thank for that." Clint shrugged. "Nah, You did the hard part yourself. As he slid his credit card into the check presenter, Lisa noticed something. He had written a note at the bottom of the receipt. She waited until he left before picking it up. A person's true character isn't in how they start, it's in how they grow. Keep going. CE. Lisa felt a lump in her throat. She folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into her pocket, right next to the first note he had sent. As she wiped down the tables for the night, she realized something. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a stepping stone. And wherever life took her next, she'd carry this lesson with her. Because sometimes the people you least expect teach you the most unforgettable lessons. As Lisa locked up the restaurant that night, she stepped outside and took a deep breath of the crisp night air. The world felt different, though nothing had changed except her own perspective. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing over the folded receipt with Clint Eastwood's message. A small smile played on her lips. She had spent so much time resenting this job, feeling stuck, believing she was meant for something better without ever giving her best where she was. But now she understood. It wasn't about the job, it was about the mindset. Over the next few weeks, Lisa kept that lesson close. She arrived at work on time, carried herself with pride, and treated customers with kindness. Even Mark, the grumpy manager, seemed to notice. He wasn't exactly warm, but he barked at her less and even gave her a nod of approval every now and then. One evening, as she was setting up tables before the dinner rush, Mark pulled her aside. "Got a minute?" Lisa tensed. "Sure." Mark crossed his arms. "You've been different lately." Lisa wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not, so she stayed quiet. He sighed. "Look, I know I'm not the easiest boss, but I've been watching you, and I think you've got potential." Lisa blinked. "Potential?" Mark nodded. "I don't say this often, but you remind me of myself when I was younger. I was stuck, thought the world owed me something, but I worked my way up, and you could do the same." Lisa stared at him. This was the same Mark who never seemed to have a kind word for anyone, and yet, here he was, telling her she had something more in her. He slid a small card across the counter. "There's a management training program. It's not a guaranteed promotion, but if you're serious about this, I'll recommend you." Lisa picked up the card, running her thumb over the embossed logo. A few weeks ago, she would have scoffed at the idea of staying here longer than necessary. But now she wasn't so sure. She looked up at Mark, a slow grin spreading across her face. "I'll think about it." That night, as she left the restaurant, she glanced up at the sky, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She didn't know where life would take her next, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never underestimate the power of a single moment, a single lesson, or a single person who believed in her. And she had Clint Eastwood to thank for that. Months passed, and Lisa found herself growing in ways she never imagined. She took Mark up on his offer and enrolled in the management training program. At first, it was overwhelming. Balancing shifts, studying business strategies, and learning the ins and outs of running a restaurant. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose. One afternoon, as she was going through inventory, a familiar presence walked through the door. Lisa looked up and froze. Clint Eastwood. He was dressed casually in a dark jacket and jeans, but his presence was unmistakable. He scanned the restaurant, his eyes landing on Lisa. A small, knowing smile appeared on his face as he approached the counter. Lisa swallowed hard, her mind flashing back to their last encounter. But instead of feeling embarrassed, she felt proud. "Well," Clint said, resting his hands on the counter. "Heard you've been making some changes around here." Lisa smiled. "Yeah, you could say that. I guess I had some perspective adjustments." Clint nodded. "Good to hear. You know, I always believe people can change if they want to. Just takes the right moment." She knew exactly what he meant. Mark appeared from the back, wiping his hands on a towel. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Clint, but he quickly composed himself. "Mr. Eastwood," Mark said. "Good to see you." Clint nodded. "Likewise. I came by to check in on the place. Looks like things are running smoothly." Lisa's chest swelled with pride. She had worked hard to get to this point, and hearing those words from him felt like validation. Clint turned back to her. "You sticking around?" Lisa hesitated. A few months ago, she would have laughed at the idea of staying in the restaurant business, but now she saw it differently. It wasn't about the job. It was about what she could make of it. "I think so," she said. "At least for now. There's still a lot to learn." Clint chuckled. "Good answer. Never stop learning." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp bill, placing it on the counter. "A little extra for good service," he said with a wink. Lisa picked up the bill and turned it over. Written on the back in neat handwriting were 4 words that made her eyes sting with emotion. "Keep going. You're capable." She looked up, but Clint was already heading for the door. "Hey," she called after him. He paused, turning slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with meaning. Clint tipped his head, and with that signature, quiet confidence walked out the door. Lisa stood there for a moment, staring at the bill, then slipped it into her pocket, right next to the old receipt he had signed months ago. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was something more, and for the first time in her life, she truly believed it. As Lisa watched Clint Eastwood disappear through the door, a strange sense of closure washed over her. She had come full circle, from the arrogant, dismissive waitress who had mocked a legend to someone who had learned humility, resilience, and self-worth. She glanced around the restaurant, seeing it with fresh eyes. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place of opportunity. A place where she had learned more about herself than she ever had before. Mark clapped a hand on her shoulder, shaking his head with a grin. "You know, if someone had told me a few months ago that you'd be running this place like a pro, I wouldn't have believed it." Lisa smirked. "Yeah, well, people change." That night, after her shift ended, she sat at a booth by the window, sipping a cup of coffee. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the bill Clint had left, running her fingers over the words. "Keep going. You're capable." For so long she had doubted herself. She had been bitter, cynical, convinced that life had given her a raw deal. But looking back now, she realized that she had been the one holding herself back. She pulled out her phone and opened her messages. Her mom had texted her earlier asking how she was doing. Instead of her usual short reply, she typed, "Hey Mom, I'm doing really good. I've been learning a lot, and I think I finally figured out what I want to do. Let's grab lunch soon. I miss you." She hit send, smiling to herself. As she gathered her things to head home, she took one last look around the restaurant. Maybe she wouldn't work here forever. Maybe her future held something bigger, something she hadn't even imagined yet. But for now, she was exactly where she needed to be, and that was more than enough. As Lisa stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a newfound sense of clarity. The small coastal town she had once resented for its quiet predictability now felt different, like a place of possibility rather than stagnation. She walked to her car, the events of the past few weeks replaying in her mind. Clint Eastwood, of all people, had seen something in her that she hadn't even seen in herself. He hadn't humiliated her, hadn't fired her, hadn't thrown her mistakes back in her face. Instead, he had given her an opportunity. She wasn't going to waste it. The next morning, Lisa arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. She tied her apron on with a sense of purpose and greeted the other employees with an energy they weren't used to seeing from her. Even Mark raised an eyebrow. "You good?" he asked. Lisa grinned. "Yeah, actually I am." She threw herself into the job, not just going through the motions, but genuinely engaging with customers, paying attention and taking pride in her work. She started staying late to learn more about the business side of things, asking Mark about inventory and scheduling. A few weeks later, an unexpected visitor walked through the door, Clint Eastwood. This time, Lisa didn't panic. She walked right up to him with a confident smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Eastwood." He gave her a knowing look. "Lisa." She led him to his usual booth, But before he could sit, she pulled out a small notepad and handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked, amused. "My menu ideas," she said. "I've been working on them after shifts, figured if I'm going to be part of this place, I should help make it even better." He flipped through the pages, nodding as he read. "Not bad. Not bad," she teased. "That's it?" Clint chuckled. "You've come a long way." He set the notepad down and looked at her seriously. "You know, you remind me of someone." Lisa tilted her head. "Oh yeah? Who?" "Myself when I was younger." Her heart skipped a beat. "I don't hand out compliments lightly," he continued. "But I'll say this, if you keep working like this, you won't just manage a restaurant. Someday you'll own one." Lisa swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than she ever had before. As Clint Eastwood finished his meal and left, Lisa watched him go with a sense of gratitude. Not because he was famous, not because he owned the restaurant, but because he had given her something far more valuable than a second chance. He had given her belief in herself, and that was worth more than anything. As Lisa watched Clint Eastwood disappear through the restaurant doors, she felt a quiet determination settle over her. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It wasn't about making up for past mistakes. It was about becoming the kind of person she had always hoped to be. Someone who worked hard, took pride in what they did, and treated people with the same respect she had been shown. Over the next few months, Lisa threw herself into her work. With an enthusiasm that even she hadn't expected, she studied everything she could about restaurant management, shadowed the chefs in the kitchen, and learned how to handle inventory. She worked extra shifts, stayed late, and even helped Mark with scheduling. One day, as she was organizing the stockroom, Mark approached her with a smirk. "You know, I always thought you'd quit within the first few weeks," he admitted. Lisa laughed. "Yeah, me too." "But you didn't," he said. "And now, you're one of the best employees we have." The compliment caught her off guard. Coming from Mark, a guy who barely gave praise, it meant something. "Thanks," she said, feeling a swell of pride. As the months turned into a year, Lisa's efforts didn't go unnoticed. Customers started asking for her by name. Regulars appreciated her friendly service, and even the kitchen staff respected her hustle. But the biggest surprise came one evening when Clint Eastwood returned. This time, Lisa didn't feel nervous. She greeted him with a smile, led him to his booth, and handed him a menu. "Good to see you again, Mr. Eastwood," she said. He glanced up at her, a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. "Lisa." She took his order, and as she turned to leave, he stopped her. "I heard from Mark," he said. "You've been putting in the work?" Lisa shrugged, but she couldn't hide her smile. "Just trying to be better." Clint nodded, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "What's this?" she asked, eyeing it curiously. "Open it." With slightly shaky hands, Lisa lifted the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As she read the words printed on it, her breath caught. It was an offer letter. She looked up at Clint in disbelief. "Is this?" He nodded. "A management position, if you want it."